Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be talking about what happens when the two hemispheres, Afro-Eurasia and the Americas, collide after the contact initiated by Columbus. This tectonic shift in world history has gotten the name the Columbian Exchange. So what do we need to know about this? We need to know that the new connections between the Eastern and Western hemispheres resulted in the exchange of new plants, animals, and diseases, and that this became known as the Columbian Exchange. So the Columbian Exchange as a term was pioneered by a historian whose name was Alfred Crosby. Look, here he is. Isn't he adorable? And he, in 1970, he writes a book, right? We can see that here, which he titles, which it's what it comes to be known as. He titles the Columbian Exchange. And what's really exciting about this and why I'll kind of get up on my soapbox about him and what he does in 1970 is it's really the beginning of world history, right? He is really excited about the hemispheres coming together. He's not excited about a particular emperor or king or battle or war. He is interested in environmental history. On the biological, right, we can kind of see, it's the subtitles here, the biological and cultural consequences of 1492. And so he is really the guy that we need to think about when we're thinking about the Columbian Exchange. And also, thanks to him, also world history. Look, here's another one of his books. You can kind of just see how much he nerded out about this. One of his other books is called Ecological Imperialism, Biological Expansion of Europe from 900 to 1900. So this is kind of his jam. And he comes up with this phrase, the Columbian Exchange, about the biological transfers between hemispheres. Okay, so right, as we noted, the first thing that we need to talk about is new plants. Okay. Most of the crop transfers are a one-way street. So for the most part, what we really get, what's really happening is that American crops are going to Europe. These are the big money crops. They're highly caloric, meaning they have a lot of calories. They're nutritious. Good things are happening in terms of American crops that are going to Europe. We do also, though, get some European crops coming to the Americas. Particularly what we're getting are grapes and wheat. They're brought over by the Spanish because they're really important for Catholic Mass, so Catholic religious services. So that's why that they're bringing those over. And then, right, the Spanish and later the Southern British colonists are really going to be into cash crops. So we're going to break those down a little bit more. Okay, so one of the big things that we need to know is we need to know that American foods become staple, meaning basic, really important crops in Afro-Eurasia, and that Afro-Eurasian populations will boom because of this, right? Europe is dependent upon crops like the potato. China becomes dependent on crops like the sweet potato. And finally, Africa becomes dependent on a crop like cassava or yucca. They're the same. So all of these are kind of tubers, meaning that they grow these root tube things like potatoes underground, and they grow in really poor soil. So because they can grow anywhere and they're really calorie dense, you can survive on just a few acres of potatoes. You're able to feed a bunch more people. Because of that, fewer people starve to death. People have bigger families because there's more food to go around. And so populations in Europe and Asia skyrocket. And this is going to come in really handy in our next time period because of the Industrial Revolution. It is not a similar exchange in terms of European crops to the Americas. Wheat and grapes and cash crops are not feeding the Amerindian population. All right, so next up, we also need to know, right, like I was saying, in the Americas, Afro-Eurasian cash crops are brought over and they are grown on plantations. We're going to talk more about plantations later by coerced laborers, for the most part, either indentured servants or enslaved people. So the biggest one, the one we really need to know about, is sugar, because sugar equals enslavement. Anywhere that there are sugar plantations in this period of time, there is going to be enslaved people working on them, because sugar is a luxury good and it is absolutely horrible to grow. You do not want to participate in growing it, so you have to be enslaved in order to do that. Okay, next up. Cash crops like tobacco, they're grown as well. And lastly, a cash crop on a plantation like rice. Also, there are crops brought over by enslaved people. So one of the big ones is going to be okra, whether you love it, whether you hate it, whether you haven't heard about it. Okra and rice that's also going to be an important crop brought over by enslaved people. And these things come together to create some pretty culturally important food, right? It's so interesting how food can tell us history, just like art can, just like buildings can. Food can too. And that is gumbo. Gumbo is the big one that we're going to be talking about today. So if you've never had gumbo, gumbo is like a stew that you can put over rice. It's really popular in Louisiana and Mississippi and kind of that like bayou region because the enslaved Africans there, they bring rice, they bring okra, and then native foods like corn, like what else? Tomatoes. You could put potatoes in it sometimes. And you serve it over rice, which are brought over by enslaved people. And so it really is one of these syncretic foods, and that's really exciting. All right, next up, we need to talk about animals. So what should we talk about? We should talk about the fact that European domesticated animals are making a big splash in the Americas. Obviously, Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro are two main conquistadors of the Aztecs and the Incas, respectively. Their soldiers are on horses. Imagine never seeing a horse before, right? Imagine the largest kind of four-legged animal that you've seen is a deer. And then you see a man on a horse, like this is impressive. So it's kind of throwing the Amerindians for a loop. But also horses and cows, they're big grazing animals. There weren't really like farms of grazing animals in the Americas, particularly in Mexico or the Caribbean or Latin America. Obviously, there were the buffalo in North America, but you can imagine the environmental impacts of animals like cows who just eat grass and eat grass and eat grass. And you need to clear a lot of jungle to make land for cows. Oh, also, that reminds me, going back to sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, rice plantations, all of that, you're cleaning the native vegetation. So deforestation and soil erosion and damage are a major impact of the Columbian Exchange as well. So we have horses, we have cows. We also need to talk about pigs. Pigs come over with Columbus as well, and they are going to tear up the native population's land as well. Obviously, cows and pigs are food animals as well. So that's going to support the natives in their recovery from the losses that they maintain, which we're going to talk about next, but not really enough. So going the other way around, American animals, well, this is the largest domesticated animal in the Americas. It's a llama. So right in South America, they have llamas and alpacas. The Europeans don't want them. They aren't very useful for them, right? They're good for carting small loads on the mountains. That's like the Europeans have horses. They don't need llamas. And then the other one is the turkey. But there are some game birds like pheasants and stuff in Europe. So they're also not very interested in the turkeys. Goodbye. So unfortunately, the last thing that we have to talk about is disease. So smallpox, measles, and malaria decimate. And decimate means like 1 out of 10. It's way more than that. I mean, some estimates are up at 90% of the population in the Americas dies because of these diseases. And like your textbook calls it the Great Dying. We absolutely cannot underestimate or overestimate the impact of these diseases. Smallpox is the worst of them, right? So here's kind of an image to show you, right? You break out in these pustules all over, your fever just rages, and eventually you, especially if you're an Amerindian, if you're a Mexica person or an Inca person, or Quechua is what they're called, in the 1520s, like you have no natural immunity to this. Remember that the Americas have been isolated. There's not a lot of long distance trade in the Americas. Like there's some, but the geography, like think about trying to cross the Rockies before trains. Like this is not probably worth it. So while there was some long distance trade, the geography of the Americas really limits the amount of long distance trade that can happen. So the type of interconnectedness that you see in Afro-Eurasia because of the trade routes, things that enabled the spread of the plague, that people build up natural immunities to, that generationally we build up immunity to. It's not happening in the Americas. And that's what's enabling such an absolutely massive amount of death because of this. So it's not great. So, for example, here are some quotes about what happens in crowded cities like Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Aztec. It began to spread, striking everywhere in the city and killing a vast number of our people. Sores erupted on our faces, our breasts, our bellies. We were covered with agonizing sores from head to foot. The illness was so dreadful that no one could walk or move. The sick were so utterly helpless that they could only lie on their beds like corpses, unable to move their limbs or even their heads, right? And so this totally destabilizes these empires, and it's hard for them to then mount effective resistance to the Spanish. And so it definitely aids in the Spanish conquest of the Americas. And I definitely, before we go, I want to read you something, of course, from Alfred Crosby, a quote from his book, The Columbian Exchange. He says, "Migration of man and his maladies is the chief cause of epidemics, and when migration takes place, those creatures who have been in isolation longest suffer most, for their genetic material has been least tempered by the variety of world diseases. Among the major subdivisions of the species Homo sapiens, the American Indian probably had the dangerous privilege of the longest isolation from the rest of mankind," right? So you can kind of see that while they had been protected from diseases, once those diseases show up, they are absolutely devastating. And so I think before we leave as well, something important to talk about is the role that things like disease can play in history, that like what is but one man or one woman in comparison to a microbe, right, to change the course of history.